So 21st June was declared as the International Day of Yoga on 10th of December 2014 by the United Nations. And this was the result of an India-led resolution mooted and supported by more than 175 countries. What is important is all of this happened in less than 3 months. It was a record speed for the UN body. And the UN General Assembly, while adopting the resolution, recognized that yoga provides a holistic approach to health and well being. Now, the resolution on International Day of Yoga was actually introduced by India's then ambassador to the UN, Ashok Mukherji, and it had 175 nations joining us as co-sponsors. Now, this is the highest number ever for any General Assembly resolution. So, we will explain the process and the hows, also what really played out behind the scene. Because Ambassador Ashok Mukherji is here with me today on this episode to take us through all that happened behind the scenes, the drama, the push, the diplomacy, the maneuvering. Ambassador Mukherjee, thank you so much for joining me on an episode of our podcast series.
Thank you, Smita. And I must say that at the outset, what a great privilege it is for me to join you. And just to update what you said in introducing the topic, because by the 11th of December morning, when the General Assembly met to adopt the resolution, we got two more countries co-sponsoring. So the number went to 177. And these
Okay.
were Lithuania and Guyana. And the Guyana story is rather interesting because we found it very odd that Guyana, which has a large Indian origin population as well, a diaspora, was missing from the list of co-sponsors. So we rang up our embassy in Georgetown. And our ambassador said, "Oh my God, this is very strange because the president had promised that we would be co-sponsoring the resolution." So he got into his car and went straight to the president's office and was able to find the president of Guyana, who picked up the phone and instructed his ambassador in the UN that before the before the resolution is gavelled, make sure Guyana's name is inserted into the list of co-sponsors. So we waited for the ambassador of Guyana to come and put his name of the country into the list, and that was the 177th country.
Wow.
176 was Liechtenstein.
Right.
So
Quite dramatic. I'm actually, I'm trying to visualize that car of the ambassador speeding, wanting to make it in time. Quite filmy, if I may say so. But I know there are a lot of anecdotes that you're going to share
yeah,
in this conversation,
that's true.
and we will sort of peel off the layers of this onion one at a time. But let me
Right.
actually start by asking you a little personal question, because all of us, as journalists, people who have interacted with you, worked with you in diplomacy over the years, they call you Max. Is there a story
Yes.
behind the nickname?
No, the nickname arrived when I entered St. Stephen's College in Delhi University in July 1972. And the first 6 weeks in those days, probably even today, are spent in what are called the initiations of ragging, of introducing the newcomers to the institution they are joining. And the students who are senior by 1 year and more are the ones who, are the ones who initiate the new students into the folklore of the institution. And my luck was that the first people who got hold of me were from a school in Rajasthan called Mayo College. And it seems that in Mayo College at that time, people who had the surname of Mukherjee were known as Max. So there I was introduced to other students as Max, and that name stuck with me for the rest of my life. I mean, till today, I'm known as Max for a lot of
I
people.
have to make actually a very sort of a figured out effort in calling you Ambassador Mukherjee constantly, because when I see you, obviously the thought that comes to my mind is hello Max. But are you a yoga practitioner yourself?
Well, I was fortunate to have been introduced to one part of yoga, which is the pranayam, the breathing part, when I was in Dubai. I was Consul General of India in Dubai in 1998 to 2001. And at that time, even teaching breathing exercises was not really part of the local regulations. So they sought the people who practiced it, they sought the use of our consulate auditorium to teach people pranayam exercises. And of course, that went into another activity of what is called today pranic healing. So I was initiated into this because our auditorium was used, and the people who organized it were very keen that the consul general also participate. So I participated, and I got introduced to the immense benefits of breathing, of practicing breathing exercises, which are a core part of yoga, of course. So that was my initiation. Later, as one worked in different countries, one saw the popularity of yoga. And nowhere was this more than in the United States, where before our Yoga Day resolution itself was thought of, there had been annual yoga events in Times Square in New York City from 2003 onwards. So this is something that you had to be aware of. And of
Right.
course, a lot of my colleagues practiced yoga and their families too, from different countries. So yoga became very much a part of our day-to-day conversations and exchanging of notes, etc.
Right. Of course, it is. It's an art of living in a way. It's a way of living for uh, tens of thousands, and in fact, billions of people across the world. Something that dates back to thousands of years. But let me just now go back to where it started, Max, because this was at the September 2014 session at the United Nations General Assembly. Prime Minister Modi was there. Of course, this was also following his historic victory. He had become the Prime Minister the first time he was going into the UN, addressing a session. And towards the end of the session is when he urged the nations present to support the adoption of an International Yoga Day. And I do know that the entire Indian diplomatic team, including you, who were, of course, then the ambassador to the UN, you were all caught unaware. You were all surprised. Tell us about what really happened at that moment.
You know, the background, every year there's a speech by the head of the delegation, which is mostly the Prime Minister of India in our case. And normally, the Prime Minister's speech is sent in advance so that it can be translated, especially if it was going to be in Hindi, as we anticipated it would be. We needed the text of the speech in advance to have it translated to English, and then from English into the UN languages, so that everybody listening to the speech in the hall would be following it closely. But in September 2014, the text of the speech was not available to us the night before, and it was only very early in the morning, at around 7:30 in the morning. The speech was scheduled for I think 10:30, and 7:30 in the morning, an English text was given to our delegation, and my colleagues, they rushed with it to get it translated into English and to have it translated into the UN languages. So the first time that we actually realized that there was going to be a proposal made in this speech for declaring an International Day of Yoga on the 21st of June was literally a few hours before the Prime Minister actually spoke. And once he spoke and made this request to the UN General Assembly, then it became for us a priority mandate for our work in the United Nations General Assembly. And because we had not prepared for this in advance, there was no file on this in the government ministries. This was literally a proposal which came out of the blue.
So,
And
what was your
therefore,
personal reaction? Was it like,
you
phew,
know,
what is
people,
it?
for people like us, it's every challenge is also an opportunity. And in multilateral diplomacy, if there's no previous history, then you are really able to do things which you may not have been able to do if it had been a proposal which had been made, for example, in disarmament, where there are many proposals and every proposal has to be negotiated against the new one, and it takes a lot of time. In the case of the International Day of Yoga proposal, since there was nothing before, we were literally pioneering our way. in implementing it. And I think that that was an opportunity. And I was very lucky that I had a team of eight young, and well, one, my deputy, not so young, but the rest of them were young uh, diplomats who had done about 10 years or 12 years of diplomacy. And they were very eager to jump into this. Because for each one of them, this was a new thing. You know, when something is new, it challenges you. And I think that I was very fortunate that all eight of us were motivated by this challenge. So we
Right.
had to first brainstorm on how to get it done. That was the first step. And then who could we reach out to? Because how to get it done involves the processes of the United Nations General Assembly.
Can you explain
And
that to our listeners? Many of them, we are hoping, are young listeners of what is really the process when you want to declare something as an international day under the umbrella of the UN. What really is the process that one needs to follow? What is the requirement for such a day to be adopted by the General Assembly?
well, the substance of it is important. So, what is the topic? In the case of yoga, because the Prime Minister had linked it with health and the environment, we were able to identify that the agenda of the General Assembly, which had been adopted earlier in September, 2 weeks before the Prime Minister's speech, contained an item of global health. So we were able to put the proposal into the agenda item, which had been already agreed to by every member of the United Nations beforehand, and and process it under that agenda item. The second was the nature of the proposal, and this was an international day. So the UN has adopted, and till today it continues to adopt many international days to commemorate events or to raise awareness of issues, etc. And in that context, there were two parameters that we had to work on. One was that all proposals for international days had to relate to international cooperation, because the core of the United Nations is the principle of international cooperation. So we had to put our proposal into the framework of international cooperation in the area of global health. And the second part of the UN processes was that any proposal for international days had to be made directly in the General Assembly and not through the committees of the United Nations Assembly. So, in a sense, it took away the initial filter that happens in the committees, but in a sense, it also enabled us to reach out to everybody at the same time without having to worry about a committee looking over its shoulder at us. And I think that these two were the big kind of processes, the procedural requirements that we had to tailor the Yoga Day proposal into. And of course, the third element, which is an element which is very, very dear to the countries which give a large part of the budget finances of the United Nations, was that no international day would be approved if it was not voluntarily funded. So we had to make sure that the proposal we were going to table in the United Nations General Assembly would not be financed out of the budget of the United Nations General Assembly contributed by these countries like United States, Germany, Japan. These are the major donors of the United Nations budget, the West European countries. The proposal could not eat into the budget which had been committed by them. So we had to commit that it would be voluntarily funded. And in our case, we said it would be done nationally. So every member state would find its own resources to commemorate the International Yoga Day.
Before I proceed, Ambassador Mukherjee, will you just shift us slightly to your left? Your just be a little center frame. Yeah, this is fine. This is perfect. Right. So that's interesting. I mean, how you were trying to find constant solutions to constant challenges that were coming your way. But I don't think many of our listeners here would actually know that the co sponsor for India on this resolution, one of the major ones, was actually China. I mean, it is unthinkable given the current tensions that continue to play out between the two countries, what we see happening at the line of actual control. But back then, who really thought, this was an idea that seemed absolutely out of the box? So, what made you reach out to China? How did this happen, Ambassador Mukherjee?
Well, it happened because in the world, even in 2014, when this proposal was made, the flow of communication in the world is more instantaneous. So, for example, just a few weeks before the Prime Minister's visit to the General Assembly of the United Nations, we had followed the first official visit, state visit of the new president of China at that time, President Xi Jinping, and his wife to India. This was in the middle of September. And during that visit, which I had watched by looking at the coverage given in Indian television channels, which were on the internet, because in time zone frameworks, we were behind and this was happening ahead. So I used to watch, and that's a habit that a lot of diplomats have. They have to watch what is happening back home so
Hmm.
that they are able to faithfully reflect their country's interests and priorities when in their day-to-day work.
I was
So
also one of the messengers. I remember covering that story, in fact.
yes. So the one visual that remained in my mind when I heard about of this proposal was a visual of the wife of the Chinese president, Madam Peng, going to Vasant Vihar
Yes.
to a school called Tagore International School. And in the course of that visit, there was a video link between Tagore International School and a partner school of Tagore International in Shanghai, which was, I think, called the Xinwan Junior High School or something, or Senior High
Hmm.
School.
Hmm.
And the students in the video link were demonstrating their national cultural traditions. And in the Indian school, it was yoga. And in the Shanghai school, it was Tai Chi. And and then the wife of the president of China, she then spent some time teaching the Indian students how to do Chinese calligraphy. And so this image was in my mind, and it therefore provided this idea, which I discussed with my colleagues. Out of eight, I think four of them had served in China. So it was very interesting for me that would this idea fly if it was made to the Chinese to co-sponsor the idea with us. And they said that the Chinese system is very regimented and bureaucratic. So an out of the box idea would have to be processed within the Chinese system. So I then thought to myself that I should meet my Chinese counterpart who had struck up a good relationship with me because he was interested in economic liberalization and we shared interests. I had worked in the World Trade Organization when China was acceding to the WTO, and we had some common areas of support and interest. And he was therefore someone I could speak to, and he spoke fluent English. So uh, I informed my team that I would be going to meet the Chinese ambassador with this idea of them co-sponsoring the proposal. And they said that one of us must come with you to take notes. So I said, why? And they said that the Chinese system is that they do not meet foreigners without somebody taking a note. So I rang up the Chinese ambassador and spoke to him in English, and I said, I'm coming alone. And he said, yes, I'll meet you alone. So I went to the Chinese embassy. But as my colleagues had forecast, there were two people sitting with him to take notes. So I made this proposal. And when I referred to the visit of their president's wife to Tagore High School, to Tagore International School, what my colleagues had done was they had downloaded for me in Chinese the reports of this visit with the photos from Xinhua. So I had a folder with me. So I
Which is
could
the
show
state
to the Chinese
agency.
ambassador. Yes, the state
Shinwa.
agency, like the Press Trust of India, so Xinhua in
No,
China.
yeah,
So
actually, Press
they
Trust
had
of India would be autonomous. Shinwa would be
now,
completely
yeah, but
state
I
driven.
am part of a generation which has grown up with PTI as being
Yes.
part of the state. Anyway, so the Xinhua, which is a credible, I mean, it's a well-known Chinese media organization. So the photo, the Chinese report of the visit, the reference to yoga, Tai Chi was all there. And that had been seen by my colleagues who spoke and knew Chinese, having worked in China before. So I carried the folder and I gave the folder and explained the idea to the Chinese ambassador. And he, as I said, because he was from a different kind of background, he was also quite open to discussing new things. He said, like, give me 4 days. It was a Thursday, so he said by Monday I'll get back to you. And on Monday, he called me and he said that I've got approval from Beijing to be a co sponsor for this proposal. So my colleagues went to his delegation and got them to sign the list, because every co sponsorship is signed on a list. So they were the first name to come onto this list from among the developing countries. And that opened the floodgates of support from a large number of fellow developing countries who saw that India and China were co-sponsoring this proposal together. So, there's a group called the G77 in China. It has 134 members out of the 193 in the UN General Assembly. And for them to get a proposal co-sponsored India and China, it was like a no-brainer for them to
Right.
support. So we got a huge number of developing countries who wanted to become co-sponsors. And within a month, we had reached 50 co-sponsors because of this.
But if it's not classified, I mean, it was in a Godfather style that you went to your Chinese counterpart and said, "I'll make an offer you cannot refuse." I mean, really, within
No,
4 days for him to get an approval from a rigid system, that's quite a record.
well, this actually goes to how does diplomacy actually work. And I think that my experience has shown that a country will have its interests. Every country has its own interests. But the envoys of countries, they are the messenger. They convey these interests, they negotiate their interests, and so on. But each person who is the envoy is a human being with his or her own interests. And in the case of the Chinese ambassador, as I was talking about, he was a person who was willing to speak in English, when many of them, even if they know English, will speak in Chinese and get an interpretation done into English. That is the traditional way that many countries like China, Russia, even Vietnam, they have this way of conducting diplomatic talks. But in his case, he was talking in English, so it was, and on the phone we spoke in English. So that was a kind of personal interaction, which was, in a sense, direct. The second was that his background was also very interesting, because he had been a part of the Chinese Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party before he came to New York. So he obviously had an awareness of their core system of how China is run, because China is run by the Chinese Communist Party, and he had been a part of that structure. So I think that gave him the kind of confidence that he could run this idea past their system faster than probably a diplomat who had not worked in the Chinese in the Central
Right.
Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. But this was something that today, when you look back, 2014, 20 up to 2015 September, was it looks like almost the golden age of international cooperation and multilateral cooperation. We were able to adopt sustainable development goals. This Yoga Day proposal was part of that process, or the goal on global health. That so yoga is celebrated later in many subsequent years as part of the SDG on health. Then we were able to adopt the climate change agreement in Paris within a month of the SDG goals. And that also required international cooperation. And in these two processes, China and India were closely aligned.
Yes.
We had no differences between us.
And these are also events where, of course, moving forward in this podcast series, we will have expert voices join us to take us through the diplomatic, in fact, maneuverings that happened. But, and, just referring to, of course, you said when you went in and you saw two note keepers in China, in the Chinese embassy, that's something that always strikes me about them. There is always that photographer, there is always that note keeper. And the moment you've had a meeting, no sooner you're out of the embassy, your photo is up on the embassy website as well in most cases. But, if on the one hand, China, of course, coming in as co sponsor, you said it really helped you get a lot of sponsors on board, co sponsors on board. But it must have confused its all weather friend Pakistan completely as to what was happening there.
Yes, I think that was September 2014 was a period of change in Pakistan transition. My counterpart was Ambassador Masood Khan, who's now their ambassador in the United States. In between, he went back and he became elected president of Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Before New York, Ambassador Masood Khan had been ambassador of Pakistan in China. So for me, this was an interesting diplomatic gambit. And I'm glad it worked the way it did because by the time any sort of doubts were beginning to be expressed in the General Assembly by some countries like Pakistan on the proposal of an International Yoga Day, the horse had already bolted from the stable. Uh, China was a co sponsor. But beyond that, so many of the countries which belong to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, there are 56 countries. So many of them actually became co sponsors of our proposal. When we finally adopted the resolution on the 11th of December, as many as 48 out of 56 countries of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation were co sponsors. So, in a sense, it also revealed the isolation or the fact that Pakistan could not use, its bilateral relations with China or its multilateral membership of the OIC to try and derail this proposal. And I think that contained a message in itself for the way Indian foreign policy can and should deal with its own interests and its own ideas.
So, but even in terms of the OIC countries that you mentioned, was there somebody who was more forthcoming that you decided to work with that could help you turn around the mood inside the room?
Yeah,
And in those
well,
days, the rhetoric on Kashmir was still pretty sharp.
yeah, it was
The
still
hostilities were
sharp. It
there
was
within the OIC.
absolutely, absolutely. But within the OIC, the most enthusiastic co-sponsors that came joined hands with us were Turkey, Iran, Syria, Indonesia, and Nigeria. So we had countries of a fairly substantive role and profile who are also members of the OIC. All the Central Asians who are also
Sorry,
members of
Ambassador
the
Mukherjee, 1 second, I'll have
OIC.
to interrupt you. I think your internet is freezing a little. Maki, is
Oh,
his audio still all right? Should I ask him to switch off the video?
It's absolutely fine. It'll be recorded on the system anyways, so it'll be fine. No problem.
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, Ambassador Mukherjee.
Yeah. So as I was saying that these
Uh,
countries,
one
like
second. Are we doing it now with the video off or video on?
The internet is fine actually.
Huh?
Sir's internet must have had a glash, but
Yeah.
you
So,
can keep it on, no problem.
sir, you can keep on the video again, and if you can just,
I'm keeping it on. I am on. Well,
I can't see you.
Yeah, it'll
oh, you can't
automatically
see
come.
me.
Once the internet gets better, he'll come back.
Okay, you can continue. Sorry, you can continue.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so we had countries from who were, involved in supporting the idea of an International Yoga Day because they themselves had people in their own sort of citizens who were practicing yoga. So they saw no reason not to support this proposal. So whether it was Turkey or Iran or Egypt or Indonesia or Nigeria, uh, uh, there was a very, very positive response to co-sponsoring this proposal. And the attempt by Pakistan, which wasn't made openly, it was made tangentially. Actually, I think came too late. The only country that probably succumbed to the combination of diplomacy between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, which was at that time missing from this group. Saudi Arabia did not co-sponsor the proposal in 2014. So between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, they were able to get one country in ASEAN to withdraw its co-sponsorship, and that was Brunei. So Brunei did not eventually become a co-sponsor, although it had signed the co-sponsorship list initial at the starting stage. And Malaysia did not co-sponsor it. So within ASEAN, Malaysia and Brunei were not co-sponsoring it, but they didn't cast a negative vote. And I think that's the beauty of this outcome, that although 177 countries co-sponsored it, there were no countries which voted against it. And therefore, it was a unanimous
But
resolution.
I remember you telling me in one of our past conversations, I can't put a finger to it exactly, but there was some last minute high voltage drama too, of somebody wanting to put out a hurdle and you perhaps wanting to, take a step where you said, I'll walk out of the room if such and such thing doesn't happen.
It was on the Security Council reform. It was very dramatic. But that's not linked
Ah,
with the yoga terrorism. That happened a year later, on 14th of in the middle of September, beginning
ah,
of September 2015, when we were adopting a text of proposals for reforming the
right.
UN Security Council. That's a separate story which we can
Yeah.
do on a separate podcast because
Yes,
I think
you've
that would.
given me another topic to add to my podcast series for sure. But so coming back again, you did mention that 2003 onwards you had started seeing the yoga events happen in Times Square. So when you talk about countries like Turkey, Iran, Syria, were these countries already having public yoga events? How popular was yoga in different parts of the world prior to this resolution being adopted?
That was the voyage of discovery for people like us in New York. When we discovered that even before we went to seek the support for the resolution, there was an awareness of yoga in a large number of delegations, which was there because in their own countries, yoga had been a part of their day to day life. And so, for example, Mozambique, my colleague from Mozambique, we were friends because we had both been posted in London before. And so when I talked to him, he said that, look, I will be the first one to support this resolution because it will focus on an area of our economy in which we are using yoga not only for health but also for tourism. And I discovered that Mozambique had been developing yoga tourism, which was a complete news to me. And I mean, I had not heard of such a thing before. Then there were countries in the Central American landmass. There were countries in the Pacific Islands who were supportive of the proposal in a very enthusiastic way because there were organizations which had popularized yoga in their societies. The art of living of Sri Ravi Shankar had been very active. The Isha Foundation had been very active. And so you had homegrown supporters and enthusiasts of yoga. And as we talked of earlier, in the United States itself, the largest number of yoga societies and associations and clubs and had existed long before the proposal for an International Yoga Day was made. So we were fortunate in getting all these diverse countries where yoga was already a part of their lifestyle to support the proposal because that would also help them to focus on this aspect of their national, activities. And the resolution clearly said that the implementation of the Yoga Day would be done by each member state of the United Nations. So, for a country like India, which was sponsoring the resolution as the main sponsor, this was a huge issue that had been already resolved before, when we came to the first Yoga Day in 2015, June 21st. I don't think there was any doubt that it would be celebrated across the world in each of these co-sponsoring countries with enthusiasm, because there were already people practicing yoga and active yoga enthusiasts in each of these countries. And when you must have seen the book that was produced by Vikas Swarup, who was heading the external publicity division at that time, on the first yoga day. And each page has a spread from each country. I mean, we were able to get photos from every country in the world except, I think, Yemen, because Yemen had a civil war which started in the late 2014. And of course, and unfortunately, the civil war can't allow any practice of yoga. So, I mean, public practice of yoga. So, this is how we discovered. It was a voyage of discovery for us.
But so looking back, what would you say was the trickiest moment in this entire negotiation process and making sure that the resolution was adopted within a record time of less than 3 months?
The two tricky things were to get to the halfway mark, because this was a resolution that required a simple majority of the General Assembly. So we needed 96 countries out of 193 to support it. And within a month, we had reached 50. By the end of November, 2 months from the proposal being made, we reached 130. So that by the end of November, we were sure we had 130 signatures of co-sponsors, and the resolution was going to be adopted. The second was it was an internal objective of ours in our own delegation, that we should have no negative votes, and we should, to the extent possible, try and accommodate every delegation to join in. So that this would, in a sense, showcase that the topic of this resolution would reflect the mantra, I call it, but the world view that we have of the world being one family. So we did not want any dissenters or people who are unhappy inside the family. So the European Union, they were the ones who kept insisting on the importance of there being no financial implications of this resolution for the budget. And this, in a sense, resulted in, we had altogether 3 informal meetings of the General Assembly. All 193 countries were invited. We chaired it. And in 2 of these meetings, this was the main sticking point, if you can call it that. But we inserted the words that it would be the financing of it would be done by member states and not from the budget of the General Assembly. And in a sense, that was the way the European Union's concerns regarding the budgeting of the International Yoga Day were met. There were no other concerns. There was nothing expressed in these informal plenary meetings of the General Assembly. So we were not, in a sense, there was no issue which was put out into the open. Even the issue which I talked of earlier of the Organization of Islamic State, OIC, that was addressed not in New York. It was addressed probably inside the bilateral framework. And later, as we know, Saudi Arabia changed its policy on yoga and allowed yoga to be openly practiced first as a sport and now as an activity in its own right. So the headquarters of the OIC located in Saudi Arabia themselves don't have any problem with marking the yoga day, etc. So I think that that was these were the issues which could have clouded the horizon, but ultimately we were able to carry everybody along.
I've known you for years. I can't imagine you getting angry Was there any point where you were losing your cool, where you had to resort to pranayam, that, cool down, let me cool down a bit?
No, this was very interesting 3 months because the passage of the 3 months, the passage of the proposal was actually marked by the signatures on the co-sponsorship sheet. And every evening, with my colleagues, we used to have a look at this. And if we were not getting a commitment on paper from a delegation which had committed verbally, we used to make sure that the next day this would be done, and if there was any big problem, I would speak to the ambassador, the head of that delegation. So it was, in a sense, a micromanaged process, but it was a process which had a momentum. And I think that that was something that drove us. And I have younger colleagues whom you also know who said that let's try and reach as much as possible in the co-sponsorship list. Otherwise, we could have easily closed the book on the 30th of November when we had 130 co-sponsors, because for a two-third majority in the General Assembly, you need 129. So we had 130 on the 30th of November when we circulated the resolution. But look at it in terms of the enthusiastic response, that between the 30th of November and 11th of December, 48 more countries joined it. And there were two on the last day, as I mentioned to you right
Yes.
at the beginning of our conversation. So this, in a sense, was an experience in which I did not lose my inherent good nature, and
I'm so glad to
and
hear that.
it was. It did not cause any heartburn or any tension. And I think it's the nature. The day we adopted it, 11th December, it was bright, sunny, but bitterly cold.
Hmm.
And in the hall, we had the acting president of the General Assembly was the Portuguese from Portugal, who was the vice president, but acting president. And in the hall, as I entered the General Assembly hall, there was a person who came up to meet me, and he was the head of the Portuguese Yoga Association. So, a Portuguese gentleman. And his helper was a lady who helped him in the Portuguese Yoga Association, but she was from Croatia. So there was this very strange feeling of having what in India we would call a dharma guru, because that is
Hmm.
what he was, but from Portugal. And he got the Padma Shri, I think, the year after that, or the 2 years later.
Lovely.
So he made sure that till the resolution was adopted, he was there. Then we took a photograph of himself, of the three
Hmm.
of us. So these are moments that you treasure. And
Hmm.
I must say that a lot of support came from within the UN Secretariat, where we didn't know that there was such a lot of interest in yoga. But in
Hmm.
the process of this resolution, I discovered that the UN Secretariat, where the permanent officials of the UN work, that also has its own yoga association, and they were very supportive. And in a sense, they guided us that if there was
Hmm.
any procedural issue, they would find the solution for us. So, it was a whole of society approach to, if I can call it that.
Beautiful. And, over the years I have been traveling, I've seen Indian yoga instructors going to China, to Japan, to several countries, and more in number over the years. A lot of foreign ambassadors here, of course, they have been trained very well in yoga. On Yoga Day, they can do some of course, the yoga poses and the postures, which are very, very challenging. But, when you now look back at how you pushed for it in terms of the organization part of it, and of course there were stunning images that were coming in from all the way from Machu Picchu to Great Wall of China to the seas, to the freezing plains. Was it worth pushing it at such a grand, extravagant scale, keeping in mind that this was supposed to be funded voluntarily? People had to spend from their own pockets, nations basically. So, why the push for such an extravagant display and the outcomes of that today? Do you think the civilizational sort of linkages of yoga that has been harnessed well diplomatically through these push?
I think this was, in a sense, the first project of the new government after it took over in the multilateral space. And the fact that it evoked such a response, which we were able to channelize and put together into this resolution, showed that there was and there is a large wellspring of opinion in countries across the world and people across the world to support things that will be positive for your own health, for your own well-being, for your own breathing. I mean, these are things which are not, which cannot become part of the weaponization of diplomatic relations. So I think that in that sense, it was worth it. The fact that in the next 2 years, I retired in 2015 December, but I followed it 2015, 2016. The images that I saw, for example, from China, we had entered into this period of problems on our border areas, etc. But the large numbers of 10,000 people practicing yoga on 21st June in China were coming from our missions and our consulates. So there is a wellspring of humanity, of human values, which exists. And I think that that is the counter ballast to the kind of polarization that first isolation that was forced on countries by the pandemic, and then the polarization that's been forced on countries in the United Nations through this war in Ukraine. And I think that this is something that accounts for the kind of response that we got in January this year to a virtual summit of the Global South, 125 countries. I mean, people want to get on with their lives to live according to their own values. And I think that this is the strongest response to attempts to again divide the world and create divisions and enmities and bloodshed and so on. And if this initiative and this Yoga Day resolution plays a role in keeping the world joined through common shared values, and these are shared values not of the kind that we hear of in political terms, but in individual terms. And I think that's important because the politics is always open to question as to what is your agenda. But in terms of your breathing, what is your agenda when you are breathing in terms of yogic practice? That is, I think, self-evidently, the answer
Right.
is there, that you cannot politicize this. So I think that is the core outcome that I take. I was aware of the commercial dimensions of yoga. It was in the United States in the newspapers. I mean, of how this was being exploited, especially in California. There were lawsuits and so on. So that part was there. Then there were, of course, parts of the scientific, prove it that yoga contributes to global health. But I think that that discussion never went anywhere because it is again goes back to the individual. And then there is this the larger framework of as a practitioner of yoga. If you really practice yoga in both the spirit and the body, because that's what it means, then can you bring positive energy to the work that you do? And I think that that is the proof of that is tested every day. But I think that people who are actually good yoga practitioners can prove that they can change that world in which they live, that narrow space around them. Yeah, and then as each one of them multiplies and becomes a larger space, the world becomes a better place. That is the hope. But
Right.
the the threat to that is constant.
And Ummeed par hi duniya kayam. Of course, the world rests on hope. Finally, why 21st of June? Why the summer solstice for the day to be adopted?
Well, I think it became part of our perspective that it was 21st of June because we don't have any part of India which is in the southern hemisphere. So we could not, because there was a reaction from countries in the southern hemisphere that that is the shortest day for us, and it's the height of winter for us, and that's true. So for us, it was linked with our own physical reality, geographical reality, that we are a country above the equator for whom the 21st of June is the longest day and the day that we have the most amount of energy from the sun's rays. And I think that links with the other initiative that we took soon thereafter, the International Solar Alliance. where we then moved into
That's
using
right.
the energy of the sun for renewable energy purposes, which again has been a huge success story of India's multilateral diplomacy. It's the only organization, international organization, that is headquartered in India, the International Solar Alliance. And so many countries are joining every day. So, this message has a reality, a ground test, if I may call it that. Take away the politics of it and take away the economics of it, it still passes the test.
So, how did you celebrate on 11th December after all the work was done?
It's my birthday.
Oh, what a superb birthday gift you got for yourself then. The best gift that you would have received and which will stay with you forever.
That's right.
This has been a pleasure talking to you. I think some of the images that were coming in after it got adopted, and some of the images that kind of were liked the most, which mesmerized the Indian audience for a lot of obvious reasons, also were images of women in Saudi, women in Pakistan, doing these complicated yoga asanas. And having talked about the backroom story with you, it's all fascinating. It's always fascinating to hear them again and again. And I must, of course, confess that I have always been a gym person for the last few years, that I've been exercising regularly. My profession doesn't allow me otherwise, at least in the years, previously. It used to always be hectic. But I enjoy my time in the gym. I sweat it out. Somehow I've always thought that yoga may be very challenging for me, so for somebody who's very restless. But I think listening into your conversation today, I'm encouraged to give it a serious shot.
You should, and not all the asanas are complicated. So you choose the asana which suits you, and I think that the benefit of yoga comes through that. It's a voluntary choice. Then nobody forces, that this sequence of asanas are what you have to do. You do what you want to do, and I think that that's the essence of democratic approach to life. That you choose what is good for you, and you do what is good for you. That's how it is.
Absolutely. And you also live and let live. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Ambassador
Thank
Ashok
you.
Mukherjee, for joining me in
Thank
this
you.
podcast.
Thank you, Smita. It's been a real pleasure to be able to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.